Testing, one, two, three. Okay, it's time to begin. Good to see you this morning. Glad you're here for our third installment of leadership in the church. It's good to have you with us today. As you know, for the past couple of weeks, we have been looking at 1 Timothy chapter 2, and I've been addressing the the admonition or the household rules is what we're talking about, because Paul writes in 1 Timothy 3, verse 15, that when he's delayed, if he's delayed from coming to Ephesus, that he has written so that they'll know how to conduct themselves in the household of God. And so that's where the idea of household rules have come from. Paul is, making some mandates concerning behavior in the church. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize was the fact that everything that's actually commanded and told to the people in Ephesus is in direct contradiction to the culture that's around them. And I belabored the idea, probably in your estimation, that we have to be very careful in the decisions we make and how we view the scripture and all of this, because we have to be cautious, because culture impacts us sometimes we're not even aware of it. It can provide filters or distort our thinking because of what we know. We're in culture, we live with it, and the pressures in culture and all that can have a direct impact upon how we start to look at certain passages. And that's always been a problem ever since the establishment of Christianity. And so I find it really interesting that the letter of 1 Timothy, in a culture in which we find all of these pagan temples and pagan priestesses, charismatic religious behavior, all kinds of instrumental music, all of that is attached to what's happening around them in Ephesus. And so when Paul writes, he's not writing because of something that is culturally conditioned. He's not taking the argument that people take today, that what Paul says is culturally conditioned, so we can decide to do it or not do it based upon our current culture. If Paul was adapting Christianity to culture, he's really failed in 1 Timothy 2. I mean, there is no adaptation. In fact, there is an abhorrence against the activities that are going on in Ephesus, in the religious culture and all that. So the argument of a cultural argument, a situational argument, does not stand, in my judgment, in regard to what Paul is mandating. The other thing is, Paul connects his argument to creation before the fall, before Genesis chapter 3. And so we looked at Genesis 2 primarily to sort of illustrate the creative order of things, how God designed men and women, and their how he places them under accountability for what God has delegated, and for men and women to be responsible for. And we will have to give an answer to that when we're called to account, because it's our responsibility. And so we've emphasized the fact that men were tasked with the responsibility of spiritual leadership, leadership in the home, and Paul will extend it that, in fact, the argument that he makes for the qualification of an elder proves my point, because he emphasizes the spiritual leadership of men in the assembly. So that is being conformed to the creation order, and when we're not, it produces chaos. When things got awry, when Eve usurped her authority and took of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and then gave it to Adam, who abdicated his authority, and he ate too, the whole world went into chaos, confusion. And it continues to be that way because sin entered the world. The sin came because of the rejection of God's way. And so when that happened, we find God addressing the issue, and he calls Adam to account, he calls Eve to account, and he addresses Satan and pronounces judgment on Satan. And then order is restored. How do you know that? Well, it says that Adam named his wife Eve. We have then the application of what was prior to sin, which is the establishment of order again. Well, it won't take long until all of that goes out the window again in every generation. Now, one of the things I wanted to press is that in the statement that God makes to Eve after they sinned, Adam and Eve, the statement is that in pain she shall bring forth children. Okay. The next statement has usually been assumed to be a sexual statement that despite the pain of bearing children, she'll still desire her husband, and he will rule over her. And I wanted to illustrate that the word desire, we come to Genesis chapter 4 in the narrative of Cain and Abel, and before Cain killed Abel, God says, now, you better be careful because sin desires you. Okay, it wants to conquer you. And, of course, Cain didn't listen, and he rose up and killed his brother. That same word is used in the Genesis 3 account, which, in light of the context, in my judgment again, what's happening here is God is identifying the central problem that exists, the temptation, or I guess I should say, the sin of men abdicating their role and women usurping that role. Okay, it's like an endless cycle. Now, the problem that women have now, in regard to the punishment, is that now, since sin is in the world, there is the potential of men leading as tyrants. In other words, and I think that's been illustrated sometimes in not only in modern times, but in the Bible itself, where men have assumed their leadership role, but it hasn't been according to the way that God designed. That's what Jesus reveals in Ephesians 5. We're going to talk about that in just a minute because of a question that was asked last week. Man was not meant to lead as a tyrant, as one who batters wives and one who throws his weight around. That was never the design. And so that's not what's being instituted. But see, that was created because of sin. Now sin is operating not only in the lives of women, but also in the lives of men. And so there's that endless, I think, and I've made the statement, I think the Achilles heel um, is that men men sin in abdicating their role, and women sin when they usurp the authority that has been given to men in spiritual, matters in the home and in the church. But then you have the problems, what if men don't lead? See, that's the problem that we see in Genesis 2. Adam was not leading. He was there, but he had, abdicated his role. He had surrendered. And all of that scenario in the narrative of Eve identifying what's good and all of this and giving it to her husband, and he takes it. I mean, who's leading here? It's Eve. And Adam is right there. God gave him the commandment. God has given him delegated authority as a leader, and he is not fulfilling the responsibility. And so that's why the New Testament says that sin came through Adam. Of course it would come through Adam. He's designated as leader. Eve sinned too, but Adam's called on the account. And when God goes back and gives the punishment, both Adam and Eve are responsible and for the downfall of what came as sin entered the world. Now, the challenge we face today is we're beginning to live in an era that's rejecting any kind of distinction between the sexes, the distinction between any roles, all that kind of thing, based upon, I think, the theory that we find in the prophets. Today, what is good is called bad, and what is bad is called good. That's what the prophets were saying about their time and culture. But that's not an excuse for us not to establish God's way. Now, you can call that restoration if you want to, but it is to align ourselves. Every movement toward God's way is to restore God's way in current culture. Now, if you look at your sheet, after going through that process, and I know it was lengthy, belaboring it, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, we begin Paul's instructions, but we needed the background and creation to understand his argument. And so in verses 1 through 7, Paul gives a general instruction for all people, and great importance for us to pray for all people. And the goal of all of this is so people will be saved. That's the backdrop of what Paul is encouraging people to pray. We're to pray for movement toward redemption. Individuals, culture, society, leaders, and we do that. But that's what Paul's talking about in the first 7 verses. Then in verse 8, he gets very specific. The first 7's generic. He uses a generic term in the original, anthropos, which is humankind, including males and females. We're all to engage in prayer. But then, in regard to the assemblies, when we come together as men and women and as the church, Paul says, I would that the anir, which is the male word in the original, pray. And it was the custom of lifting up holy hands. And the idea of that, not everyone in the Middle East always lifted up hands. It was a custom among the Jews to do so. But that wasn't what Paul is trying to emphasize. He's not emphasizing the custom of raising hands. I can't turn that palm yet. I'm still working on it. But it's the idea when you raise up hands, you're revealing your hand. Take it from a card game. If you've been a gambler in the past, I don't know. You don't show your hand, but when you show your hand, you reveal yourself, okay? And so it's the idea that when our hands, you go up for prayer and God looks down, he sees filthy hands, which is symbolic of sin, corruption, so, I emphasized last time, I'm, for whatever reason, of people imagining that, a certain posture is more spiritual than others, I would caution one in thinking that way, because what Paul says and what the prophets say, I think I'd rather keep my hands down behind my back, because I'm embarrassed to reveal my hand. Does that make, I don't want to say sense, because I use that all the time in class and stuff, but does that resonate with you? So it's the idea in every place. This is a reference to every assembly, every place, the place of assembly that happens, then men are to lead. And that's consistent with, creation account. Then there's some special instructions for women. I would think that there was a lot of temptation among women in Ephesus to emulate the culture, just as there are for men. But Paul is focusing now on the status of women in Ephesus. And so there's a big push for women not to be caught up in externals, and to remind themselves, despite the pressure of all around them concerning externals, dress, hair, trinkets, all of this. You can see it through history, all the way back to the Egyptians. To be concerned about women professing godliness. That's the emphasis. It's not that any of that is wrong. It is to be aware of what you're professing by what you wear, how you behave. All of that is important. It's the same thing for men too, but it's emphasized here because that is the emphasis in Ephesus. Now, the mandate here is specifically for females, okay, in contrast to males. Now, after Paul makes this statement, he gives the reason why he's made the statement about women. I'm sure back in Ephesus culture, there would be women who protested what Paul said, just as there are today. It was probably worse back then in Ephesus because of such prominence of female leaders, spiritual guides, all of that stuff. Okay. So he gives three basic reasons. The first one is the principle of the creation order. He says, for Adam was created first. Well, what does that mean? Okay, is this a fact? We're going to have a fact, okay? Who's created first? Adam. Okay. Well, there's a theological basis for that. And what I mean by that is God is, through Paul, is emphasizing something religious concerning the order of creation. It wasn't kind of a fluke. It wasn't that God, it was his first time. So, he's creating, and so he made a mistake. No, it's all designed. And Paul makes that statement as the reason why he's emphasizing and teaching the things that he's teaching. So there's the probably word is not primacy. He's not saying that males are primary. He is indicating that the position of the creation order is illustrating what he's just taught, and why there needs to be that distinction in leadership and the emphasis that he's just made. So it's the order of creation. The second thing is, it is the misappropriation of that order that led to sin. which is so very apparent in Genesis chapter 2. So when things are out of order, each becomes susceptible to temptation and sin, always. So that's one of the reasons that Paul gives. It goes back to creation. Then the argument, third argument, is that women will be preserved through childbirth. And so one reads that today in culture and says, I see. You want women to be barefoot in the kitchen and pregnant. Shut up and be quiet. Well, that's the distortion of what's being talked about. That's what a tyrant would say. A sinful person. That's not what God intended. So when he talks about women shall be preserved or saved through childbirth, he's using that word childbirth in a figurative way to represent those things that women are responsible for. There's figures of speech all through the Bible. I've given you two, the possibility. I think it's a synecdoche, but it could be a metonymy. These two things come into play in the use of the word child birth. The synecdoche is a figure of speech in which a part of something stands for the whole of it, or the whole may stand for a part of it. And so, I have an example here. Wheels may stand as a part representing the whole, like a car or a truck. So, if I've even said this before, come out and look at my wheels. Well, you come out and you're not looking at the wheels. What I mean by that is check out my ride. Check out my car. See, I used it again. We use those things all the time without recognizing that they are actually labeled figures of speech. And I think this is what Paul is doing, because the one thing that distinguishes men and women, it's, this is always a fun thing. I know there's a lot more, but the one thing that women can do that men cannot, despite what people say today in culture, is that they have babies. And so taking the part which obviously distinguishes a female from a male is representing the whole of responsibilities that God has given to her. Not that she's just been reduced, and salvation is dependent on bearing children. And that's what you're to focus on. Paul's not using it that way. He's representing the responsibility of womanhood. Well, how do you know that? Well, I know that because, number one, how figures of speech are used, but also the context. He'll emphasize again the responsibilities of women when he talks about deacons. And the other reason I know is because what follows that, a conditional sentence, which means she shall be preserved or saved through childbirth if she is what? Faithful. What else? You see it in the text? Y'all looking at the Bible? You're looking at she? Where? What Bible? If she continues in love, sanctity, with self-restraint. See, that right there is excluding the idea that all she has to do is bear children. See, that conditional sentence is underscoring the fact that it's not the bearing of children, it is the acceptance and the implementation of God's way in her life. So, I want to go to 1 Timothy chapter 2 now. I want us to read it. Now, someone said or asked last week, well, what would be usurping authority? Okay, in a practical way. What would be violating God's arrangement? And, I hemmed haul around and all that, because I think it's not in a particular action per se. It is the attitude. The challenge of women is to defer to the male spiritual leadership. And only you can do that. That's what we call submission, what the Bible calls. So it's to defer. Well, what if I'm smarter than he is? Well, nothing indicates that there can't be a conversation about things. And a wise woman, I think, would be very diplomatic and talking to her husband, like my wife is. I mean, I'm dumb in a lot of things, but she has a way of her decision becoming my decision. No, but she's very diplomatic, in conversation or discussion about things. But she defers, and I take in consideration, things that are said, because I respect her and appreciate her, and I know how wise she is. So I think it's in the attitude is the problem. And so I'll go to Ephesians chapter 5. I always give you the basic passage when Paul talks about husbands and wives. And I find it a neat distinction. And so go there real quick before we read 1 Timothy 2. And I think armed with this, you can determine what is usurping and what's not. A husband can determine what's real leadership and what's being a tyrant. Okay? And it all goes back or forward from Genesis 2 to Ephesians 5, when the Bible talks about the marriage relationship. Notice what he says. He says, wives, verse 22, be subject to your own husbands. Now, he's already said in the prior verse that we're all subject to one another. See, I think there's been some confusion sometimes. Is the husband ever subject? Well, let's continue reading. Wives, be subject to your own husbands. Why? Why are you encouraged to do that? Because he's such a dude? Why are you encouraged to do that? What's the motive? As to the what? That's why you do it. It really has nothing to do with him. And, thinking of it, it's all about your relationship with God. That's why you do it. Now, to not do it is to illustrate your relationship with God. For the husband is the head of the wife. There's the leadership, accountability. And why is he the head? And how is the head described? As Christ also is the head of the church. He himself being the Savior of the body, but as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in some things. What's he say? In everything. Why is that? Because you are showing your faith to God. What if he's wrong? If you not talk to him, still nothing changes. There's a certain attitude, behavior toward husbands. Now, you've always indicated, or it seems like in culture, that seems to be the problematic thing, submission to everything. Well, I think the problematic thing is what he says about men. You're talking about an ideal. And when men have a tendency, sometimes we can be competitive, but also there's a temptation to be regressive, that is to back away. And that might be because the ideal's too hard. The man can foresee, there's no way. But listen what it says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church. Now, he goes on all about that. Okay, is he talking about a tyrant? No. The husband, his goal is to be like Christ in their relationship. Well, he's not, but he's trying to be. That's his goal. Make mistakes? Yes, I know Jesus is perfect. But a man who is pursuing that kind of behavior and attitude is aligning himself with God, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So all husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it, cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. There's kind of like an overlapping of the church and the marriage relationship. But he goes on and on and on about the attitude and the actions of the husband and what Christ has done for the church. That's our model, guys. If you're a husband, if you're a man, that's our model. This mystery is great, he says, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, each individual among you also to love his own wife even as himself. Okay, how many times has he used love in regard to the husband's action toward his wife? Several times, right? He uses the word love. Christ loved the church. God is love. Okay? Now, what's interesting is what he says to wives. He doesn't say to wives, be sure you love your husbands. Now, I want my wife to love me. But if she wants me to go to the ends of the world, I desire respect. Wives, be sure you respect your husbands. Don't you find the word change interesting? I think that nails one of the primary differences between men and women. So, this idea of anything that I could identify, well, if you're, have a husband or whatever, and you're kind of around him, you kind of, you show him deference and everything, and then you go talk and say, what a rascal, sorry individual, this is stupid. I was at the grocery store the other day. This woman was on the phone, and I heard her say, just when I walked, all men are stupid. I don't know who she was talking to, but I wanted to say, well, I'm not, But if that's the attitude you have toward your husband, then I think that will cause you to behave in a way that's disrespectful. Yes or no? I think it will. So it's not in any action per se. It is it's the attitude. This doesn't mean that women can't voice an opinion about this or that. It's all about, wrapped up in the idea of respecting the husband, and all about the husband loving the wife. Now, I don't think it's all that complicated. It is hard when you put emotions in it, and when you add sin in it, and culture pressure, all this stuff. It can get pretty muddy. But to unwind out of all that muddiness, it becomes very simple. So the answer to me is in the attitude. If I lose respect, or I don't show the respect, I don't have the respect, then it's going to show up in my actions toward my husband. And the same is true in regard to the husband. His misunderstanding of love, his sinfulness, his immaturity is going to come out in his leadership or lack thereof. See, that's where the problems are. That's what Christ comes and begins to solve. Yes, go ahead. And I'm no way saying that the woman ought not to love her husband, and all that. But I think it's interesting that there's a distinction that's made. It's I think at a very primary, deep level. Now, back to First Timothy chapter 2. Any questions on that or observations? Am I totally missing the point? Go ahead. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. 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 Yeah, I think it is a blessing when we behave and are uh, what we ought to be. The problem is, I was asking you, what if he wasn't? Would you still be submissive? I know. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Right, right, right. And you laugh at that, but there's a lot in Proverbs about the nagging wife, and not, I have fun with my wife. It's better to dwell on a housetop, you know, than to be in a house with a brawling woman. You know, uh, all those proverbs are is an illustration of sin. You know, so but then again, we live in a sinful world, and so it makes the matter complicated. It's really not, but it's not always easy. Mhm. Yeah. Well, your primary role is to God. No, I mean, if yeah, it's like what I guess Peter and others would say that where our primary faithfulness is to God, no matter. Yes, Charlie. Yeah, and the issue is trying to get them to take the lead because it's a hard cycle to break. Men will, by nature, I think, allow women to lead, and they can hang back.
I think too often we've submitted ourselves to the Archie Bunker caricature of what a husband and wife is supposed to be.
Yeah,
All the family picture is just indelibly ingrained on the brains of so many people. That's what you're wanting us to do. Guy
right.
sits there in the recliner and just fusses
It's a
all
big
day.
bozo. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the wife is a complete
Mm.
nitwit. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the caricature,
Yeah.
and we've got to overcome that in our culture.
Yeah. Right. 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 Well, what should have Eve done? She's there at the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and Satan's talking to both of them, but Satan's looking at her. Yeah. Or what are you looking at me for? I don't know, but certainly she shouldn't have rationalized and taken the fruit. Adam, what do I mean, that would have been a good place to I guess, kind of, what do you call it, passive aggressiveness in regard to Adam? I mean, we haven't explored that. Eve wasn't like, she had to do what she did. Now, back to the text in 1 Timothy 2. Now, Paul talks about the difference in men and women. Okay, in verse 15, he talks, gives that, but women will preserve through the bearing of children, all that, being responsible for your, what God has delegated to you. In 1 Timothy 3, he then goes to leadership roles. He talks about an overseer, which is an elder, being the husband of one wife. And he gives the qualifications for the elders. And he says, if a man, this is in verse 5, if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? So, just by an indirect way, Paul's made the argument that we've been making about, home and then the extension to church. The home is the proving ground for one to be ready to assume leadership in the church. And then he gives the, some qualities and characteristics of an elder. Then he goes to deacons. Deacons likewise must be what? Men of dignity, not double-tongued, addicted to much wine, fond of sordid gain, but holding the mystery. These men also must first be what? Tested. Then let them serve as deacons if they are beyond reproach. A lot of the qualifications are almost nearly identical to the elderships. Then we have verse 11, the controversy of whether these are wives of deacons or women. I think they're women. I don't think they're wives. You don't have qualifications for the wives of elders. And the way the word women is used, Paul is reiterating in regard to the responsibility of women as he's talking about deacons. He's already done that with elders. Now he's reasserting, and I believe it's women likewise are to be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate, faithful in all things. If you look at verse 15 and 1 Timothy 2, verse 15, and then 3, verse 11, you'll notice the parallel there. What women, the emphasis upon female, women, and then women here. And then in verse 12, he reverts back to deacons for specific qualities. He says deacons must be the husband of only one wife, good managers of their what? Children and their own households. For those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a high standing and great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. Now, I can't say that it doesn't change anything, even if it is translated wives. The Greek word can be either one, depending on the context. But I'm taking it as Paul in his use of the term and how it's flowing, that I think he's reiterating again, he's emphasizing, he's brought what he said in chapter 2 into chapter 3 to remind in this context of elders and deacons, again, of what is important for women to understand about what God is expecting from them. You were going to say something? Well, I think that's true, but I think that happens with what Paul is saying in verse 15. Um, so your opinion is not accepted in this class. No, no, I mean, I'm giving you, I'm giving you the correct side. Okay, no, I just wanted you, and I wanted you to see it in how I laid it out here on the paper. Okay, so you can see the flow. And I think Paul, in my judgment, is reiterating. It doesn't matter if it's wives or women, but I think my case, um, it seems to me that he's emphasizing as he talks about these differences of leadership, that he's reasserting through all of this the emphasis on women's responsibilities in the midst of these qualifications. Um, so, yes, go ahead. Uh-huh. Mhm. Yeah. See, this is what men don't like. You know, the the responsibility. Um, well, she was talking about a fraud that occurred where she worked at a bank, and she turned it over to the powers to be and to her husband, and didn't worry about it anymore. So, um, so that's I think there's a lot of issues to cover, but it ultimately I think comes down to our acceptance of God's way. And you have to figure it out in your particular situation. I can't answer whatever action, because an action in one setting could be disrespectful, in another setting not. So it depends on the attitude of the individual. All right.